Dismayed by the post-election chaos in Iran, Western nations urge Tehran to end the crackdown against pro-reformist protesters. Are Western governments truly concerned about the safety of Iranian civilians? Or does a defiant Iran have a case that foreign, hidden hands are encouraging a soft revolution? This is Inside Story. Hello, I'm Imran Garda. Is Iran's election Iran's problem? A question that has surfaced after the disputed presidential election resulted in 2 weeks of street demonstrations, the biggest since the 1979 Islamic Revolution. And as Iran clamps down on the protesters, the violence on the streets of the country has had long-reaching repercussions, with various leaders condemning the way authorities have handled the situation. This, in turn, was criticized by Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. He blamed the West of inciting the violence and interfering in Iran's affairs.
I will tell you the outstanding diplomats of some Western countries who talk to us with diplomatic courtesy. Up to now, during the past few days, they have taken their masquerades away from their faces and they are showing their true image. They are displaying their enmity against the Islamic State, and the most evil of them is the British government.
In addition, the US was also blamed for the problems in Tehran. The Iranian Interior Minister Sadiq Massouli accused the CIA of funding the rioters. US President Barack Obama refuted the allegations and clarified the American stance yet again.
Some in Iran, some in the Iranian government in particular, are trying to avoid that debate by accusing the United States and others in the West of instigating protests over the election. These accusations are patently false. They're an obvious attempt to distract people from what is truly taking place within Iran's borders. This tired strategy of using old tensions to scapegoat other countries won't work anymore in Iran. This is not about the United States or the West. This is about the people of Iran and the future that they, and only they, will choose.
Well, joining us now are our guests in Tehran, Saeed Mohammad Marandi. He's head of North American Studies at the University of Tehran. In Washington, D.C., Joshua Goodman. He's the director of the research at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. And in Norwich, David Seddon. He's a professorial fellow at the School of Development Studies at the University of East Anglia. Thank you very much for joining us, gentlemen. Mr. Goodman, if I could start off with you. Barack Obama was adamant that there's no CIA or foreign hands in supporting these protesters. Is there any substance at all to the Iranian claim that there are foreign hands in supporting this so-called velvet or maybe even green revolution in Iran, or is it all just paranoia from the regime?
I think it's certainly paranoia, and I would even go further and call it propaganda. I think the purpose of the Iranian regime and of Ayatollah Khamenei making these statements was simply to prove to the Iranian people that the problem is not internal, but rather an external threat. There's no merit to the claims whatsoever. Barack Obama I think, said it quite well, that really the Iranian regime is trying to manipulate past tensions and use it to scapegoat what is really an internal division and an internal problem. He himself has been very cautious in what he said publicly regarding the situation in Iran, in part because he doesn't want it to seem like the U.S. is meddling in Iranian politics. Barack Obama is very aware of the past history of the United States in Iran and is doing, I think, taking the necessary steps to ensure that they don't make the same mistakes they've made in the past.
Saeed Mohammad Marandi, paranoia and propaganda, says Mr. Goodman. What do you say?
Well, I think I should clarify something here. What they were talking about were the riots and not the demonstrations that were taking place early on, which were quite large. Of course, they didn't compare to any of the major demonstrations that we've had, and you can look into your archives and compare them. But the United States is definitely interfering in Iran's internal affairs. All you have to do is look at the over 30 Persian channels, television channels, forget the radio channels, that are beaming 24 hours a day into Iran from the United States with U.S. government support, alongside government-owned channels owned by the United States government and its European partners, which are day and night beaming into the country, trying to create unrest, spreading rumors, and trying to turn people against each other. I think it's I think it's quite obvious that they are playing a very significant role. You have no other country in the world like Iran, which has tens of television stations being broadcast into its country funded by foreign governments. And also some of the shootings that have taken place in Iran, the people have been shot and killed who have had nothing to do with any demonstrations, or at least there were no policemen around. There's been a spate of killings in the city, and people are concerned about where these people are coming from. And there are rumors that some of them are coming from Iraq or from Pakistan. I don't know if they're true or not, but obviously there was no, for example, this young lady Neda who was killed, there was no policeman around, and there was no reason why a police officer should have shot her. So I think there are a lot of people in Tehran who are beginning to think that there are forces out there who do wish to create chaos in the country. Now, whether this particular case that I'm talking about has anything to do with the U.S. government is another thing altogether. But the U.S. government is supporting terrorist organizations that are active in the country and other terrorist organizations which are currently based in Iraq.
David Seddon, is Mr. Marandi just spinning government propaganda, or does he have a point?
No, I'm sure he has a point, but let's get real about this. Both the US government and the British government, which appears now to have been accused of being the major evil force, have long-standing interests in what happens inside Iran. And of course, everybody knows that both those countries and others have intelligence agencies and are involved in trying to discover what's going on inside Iran. But it's totally disingenuous, I'm afraid, to suggest that the massive demonstrations that we've seen over the last few weeks and the continuing riots are not in some way related to major movements of concern within Iran. I mean, if the US and Britain really had an interest in creating disturbances of this kind, they would be extraordinarily successful and would have done so far earlier. No, what's happening is there's a massive movement of unrest and concern within Iran, which has produced massive demonstrations among the opposition. And of course, both the US and Britain and many other countries around the world are indeed interested in what's happening. This is a real test of Iran's democracy. And so far, the response of the regime has actually been to fail to respond to real concerns of Iranian people. I think the whole discussion about the foreign interests and disturbances and agitators, it may have some substance, but it's actually not real in terms of explaining what's happening inside Iran. This is a major movement, and the regime has to confront that in some way. So far, it's confronted it with an oppressive response and not in a healthy and democratic fashion.
Well, Israel's leadership has also had a little bit to say regarding the post-election chaos. On Sunday, Israeli President Shimon Peres encouraged Iranian protesters and said it's more important to have regime change in Iran than an end to the country's controversial nuclear program. And on Tuesday, his Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu was even more forceful in his support for the demonstrators on the streets of Iran.
Iran is not only supporting its terrorist proxies that oppose peace, Hezbollah and Hamas, it's repressing its own people. And I believe that the courage shown by the people of Iran in facing bullets in the streets for the sake of freedom is something that deserves the salute of free men and women everywhere.
Saeed Mohammed Marandi in Tehran, I'm not so sure the protesters would want the blessing of Benjamin Netanyahu and Shimon Peres, would they? Wouldn't it delegitimize their cause in many ways?
Well, I think there are really two issues here. I think that, first of all, you're absolutely correct. Most of the protesters, by far, the majority of the protesters would definitely not want the support of someone like him. Remember, Mr. Mousavi, as well as the other three candidates opposing Mr. Ahmadinejad, consider Israel to be an apartheid state and a state without legitimacy because it is racist by nature. But I think, going back to the previous point, your good guest should take into account the fact that regardless of whether one likes President Ahmadinejad or not, it seems to me at least, and I did not vote for either of the two gentlemen, that Mr. Ahmadinejad did win the elections. And he also can bring just as large crowds, if not larger, as Mr. Mousavi's supporters. I don't think that's the issue. I think the problem is that the United States is assuming certain things in Iran, and the Western media as well, that this election was false, that they cheated and won, because they have an interest in it being perceived that way. And I think that there is really no debate in the United States and in Western European countries as to whether Mr. Ahmadinejad has popular support or not. I particularly believe that both sides have gone too far, that Mr. Ahmadinejad and Mr. Mousavi took the debate, in the debates they became emotional, they attacked each other very harshly, and to an extent they brought about this situation. But I think that Western countries, instead of trying to intensify hostility in the country, which they are doing through their Persian language television programs, if they were honest about stability in the region and in Iran, they would try to behave in a more responsible manner. And I think the fact that the United States supports despotic regimes throughout the region does show that it's not very sincere about democracy in Iran.
Let's bring in Joshua Goodman. Mr. Goodman, Said Mohammad Marandi doesn't dispute the election figures at all. Basically what he's saying is, you may not like it, but the people voted for Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, whether you like it or not, and you've got to accept their democratic mandate. What's your response to that?
Well, it's certainly possible that the people voted for Mahmoud Ahmadinejad. In fact, since we were on the topic of Israel, there are reports saying that the Mossad actually believe Ahmadinejad won. But there are still irregularities in the process, which is something that even the Guardian Council acknowledged. It may well be that he won, and it may well be that he won with the majority. We don't know. But what is happening now is that and from the U.S., what the concern is that the people of Iran clearly were bothered by the mechanism by which this came about, and feel that they have not been given the right to express their opinion publicly. And now you see this severe and brutal repression of these protesters. That's the issue for the U.S. In fact, if you watch statements from the U.S., they certainly said there were issues of concern regarding the results, but no one has said publicly that it is very clear Ahmadinejad did not win. In fact, they've tried to avoid commenting on the political process itself and rather focused on the repression of the
Let's
protesters.
pose some of this to Mr. Marandi. Mr. Marandi, if the government has nothing to hide, if the president has nothing to hide, why the brutal crackdown? That's one of the fundamental questions here, because whatever the election results were, it definitely seems in many circles as if the election was rigged, given the paranoia, given the heavy-handed backlash.
Well, no, again, I don't believe that the elections were rigged. I think that the polls before the election, even a poll carried out in the United States, I think by Terror Free Tomorrow, showed that he had a commanding lead. As I said, I have, my own views are irrelevant here. The Guardian Council, by the way, has not spoken of any irregularities. Unlike what has been reported in the Western media, they have basically said that so far they haven't found major irregularities. The point is, and I think again both sides are to blame, both the Ahmadinejad camp and the Mousavi camp. The point is that Mr. Ahmadinejad made some very harsh comments both before and after the elections, which he shouldn't have. And Mr. Mousavi, I think, mistakenly took his people to the streets. He could have waited a couple of days. And the problem was that all of his demonstrations were held in the heart of Tehran, in the business sector, and many people, ordinary people, suffered as a result. And because the police were overstretched, you had chaos, you had riots, which I'm sure neither Mr. Mousavi or Mr. Ahmadinejad wanted, but extremists took control of parts of Tehran, started burning shops, and that's one reason why the police began to come down harshly. And a lot of people right now are very tired of this situation. So I don't think you can really blame one side or the other. The problem is that both of these gentlemen, their supporters have to begin cooling down a bit. They have to behave more responsibly. I think that is happening now. But the police, they have a duty to keep order in the streets. And I really don't think they are the ones to blame. The ones that I think are to blame really are some of the hot-headed politicians and some of their hot-headed supporters on both sides.
But isn't also the Supreme Leader to blame in saying that don't demonstrate or else?
No, he said do not break the law. The problem is that the problem really is that some are beginning to believe that some of the supporters of Mr. Mousavi are no longer under his control. And instead of asking for, let's say, they haven't even gone to the government to request for rallies, let's say, in stadiums or in parks where there are very few people. They constantly are trying to gather in very crowded parts of town. I think that this is a big mistake. I think both sides should stay off the streets for a few days to calm down, let the Guardian Council, along with the representatives of all the candidates, go through the ballot boxes. Since the elections were computerized and everyone's vote is accounted for, all the stubs of the ballots have fingerprints on them. Every vote is accounted for. 700,000 people were involved in the voting process. I think it can clearly be revealed what has happened. If they go through the legal process first and then start arguing, I think people will see that as being more legitimate.
I want to move on and just take a step back historically. The West is allegedly supporting opposition leader Mir Hussein Mousavi. Let's rewind back about 20 years and look at what Time magazine had to say about Mousavi. In an article dated 12th of January 1987, he was labelled, quote, a fervently anti-US radical. David Seddon, there seems to be a bit of a disconnect there, doesn't there?
Yes, I think so too. And I'm a little worried that the focus has now moved from explaining this massive event by foreign powers to an explanation now which relies on hotheads and extremists and so on. This is the standard talk of those who are trying to draw attention away from what is a massive social movement of opposition. Now, the regime has not, I gather, although our reports in our Western press suggest something different, has not admitted irregularities. But the suggestion now of recounting implies that there is a need to rethink and there is a possibility of substantial irregularities. Now, Mr. Mousavi and his supporters have argued that there were, and I think it's really unlikely that they would be able to have got so many people out in the streets in the center of Tehran and elsewhere if it wasn't genuinely considered by the opposition that the elections had been unfair and rigged. I think we really do need to focus on what's happening inside Iran. There's no doubt at all that in the past Mr. Mousavi has certainly been anti-imperialist. I think this is neither here nor there. The fact is he is a Democrat. He stands as a presidential candidate in opposition to Mr. Ahmadinejad, and there is every reason to believe, I think, that he and his supporters feel that they've been badly treated and are responding on a large scale. Now, given that, it's not surprising that Western powers, which claim to be Democrats, rightly or wrongly, support the opposition movements. But I think what we should be concentrating on is the inside struggle, the struggle between different parties and different movements inside Iran, and trying to understand and make sense of that, instead of distracting attention by talking about external influence and agitators and so on. This is a mass demonstration of opposition to the present regime. And as I think has been said, no one has actually said whether Mr. Ahmadinejad has actually won or not outside the country. But the regime is prepared to act with extreme force to repress the opposition. And I think that's an indication of the, if you like, of the irregularity and in effect, one might say, the illegitimacy of the regime.
Joshua Goodman, with this division, we've seen some serious fractures within the government, as Mr. Seddon mentioned, among the leadership, Ayatollah Khamenei and Akbar Hashemi Rafsanjani, for example, those pro-Ahmadinejad and those protesting. Is the revolution, in your opinion, 30 years on, at a crossroads?
I certainly think it faces substantial issues. Yes, you have the divide within the ruling conservatives and the Rafsanjani Khamenei, the Rafsanjani Ahmadinejad divisions are very important. But I think as we've been commenting, the real story is what's going on inside Iran, what's going on with the people. You have a demographic change in Iran. You have 70% of the population who is now, or at least 70%, as is reported widely in the West, that's under the age of 30. these people have a different perception of what life should be in Iran than the clerics have, than the rulers have. This is a new generation. This is not a generation that was born during the revolution, but born after the revolution, many of whom were born after the Iran-Iraq War. They haven't been defined by the same global events that have defined even what you could call the second generation or Ahmadinejad's generation of Iranian leadership. I think you're seeing a real change, and there are people suspecting that this is the end of the Islamic Republic. I think it's far too early to do so now, but it's certainly an indication that there is a movement to change the face of Iran, however, whether slightly or in great, to a great extent.
Movement to change the face of Iran.
It will happen at some point.
Sorry, let me pose this to Saeed Mohammed Marandi. Are the people calling for revolution or merely reform within the current system?
Look, I think we're missing the point, really. In Iran, there was a democratic election. Someone won and someone lost. We don't see unrest in the provinces because in the provinces, Mr. Ahmadinejad clearly won. We do have unrest in Tehran, or at least we did have over the last few days, because Tehran is deeply divided. The north and the center they largely support Mr. Mousavi, and the other half of the center and the south, they largely support Mr. Ahmadinejad. Both sides can bring huge crowds to the streets, but I think we do not have that sort of thing in other countries in the Middle East and in North Africa, and we have that in Iran, and I think that is a major plus. It has been said that over the last 20 years that people are tired of the revolution, that people want change. But this has been said, as I said, over the last 20 years, we still have an Islamic Republic, we still have democratic presidential elections. The election outcomes have always been unpredictable. The same is true with parliamentary elections and elections to choose those who choose the leader himself, the Council of Experts, as well as local elections. This is something that is lacking in countries that are allied to the United States. And I think that the sort of repression that we see in Egypt and in Saudi Arabia and in Jordan are incomparable to anything that we have in Tehran. And I think it's pretty disingenuous.
Let me pose that. That's an interesting point. We only have a minute left, Mr. Marandi. Let me pose that quickly to Mr. Seddon. That's a fair point. Why don't we see the U.S. complaining about the riot police cracking down on people in Egypt or the lack of democracy in Saudi Arabia?
No, I think it's an excellent point. I'm absolutely no defender of the American history over the last 10 to 15 years of support for so-called democracy while upholding repressive regimes. I think it's an extremely good point. I think the Islamic Republic is to be credited with a degree of democracy and openness that is widespreadly, is lacking in many other countries within the Middle East, including, I may say, in Israel. But that doesn't detract from the fact that we now have a major movement, political movement inside Iran, which is causing and arousing attention, precisely because it reveals the scale of the opposition, the importance of the opposition, and the refusal, as I understand it, of the regime to accept that that opposition exists on the scale that it does, and is attempting to repress it rather than negotiate and make sense of what is in fact a very interesting development. Now, I certainly would not support the idea that,
Final thought, Mr. Marandi, very quickly, 20 seconds, please.
I don't think we should call it a regime. The state is not a monolithic entity. I think that there is recognition of all sides, and all these people on both sides are huge in numbers, and they are recognized. The fact is that the politicians have to slowly learn to live with each other, and I think that that is what most people want on both sides of the political equation.
All right, we have run out of time now. Thank you very much, gentlemen. Saeed Mohammed Marandi,
thank you.
Joshua Goodman, and David Seddon. Intriguing times ahead. And thank you so much, the viewer, for joining us here on this edition of Inside Story. As always, we welcome your comments and your suggestions. You can email them to us at insidestory@aljazeera.net. Bye-bye.